Hello, we're here today to begin a 4-week online course with spiritual teacher Fran Bennett. The course is entitled Awakening to Spirit. So forgive me, I'll have to read some of this. The course is entitled Awakening to Spirit, the Path and Practices that Lead to Transcendence. There are 4 parts to the course. There'll be a video teaching each week and also a Zoom meeting, a Zoom video meeting, where there'll be an opportunity for course participants to meet together to discuss with Fran that week's course, and an opportunity for questions and answers. So part 1 of the course is entitled Mindfulness of Body and Mind. And that will be looking at how mindfulness cuts against the grain of egocentricity. In week 2, we'll be going deeper into mindfulness and awakening to the witness. The 3rd part of the course will be deepening into the witness and awakening to unity consciousness, looking at some compassion practices such as Tonglen and Metta. And in the final part of the course, in week 4, we'll be taking a step beyond mindfulness. We'll be looking at some practices to help us awaken to awareness of awareness. The first practice we'll be looking at is the contemplative prayer practice found in the mystical text, The Cloud of Unknowing. And the second practice is sometimes called Atmavikara, or self-investigation, which is a teaching of Ramana Maharshi. So this final part of the course will very much be looking at awareness itself and the practice of awareness of awareness. So welcome to Fran, and now we'll begin the first part of our course.
Hi everybody, we're going to start our first course today, and I thank you for being a part of this, and I look forward to seeing some of you during our Zoom meeting. Today we're going to be talking about the practice of mindfulness and how this practice cuts against the grain of the primary problem, the reason why we are seeking spiritually to begin with, and that is the problem of egocentricity. In most spiritual teachings in the non-dual world, we hear a lot about ego. We hear ego, frankly, gets a very bad press, one could say. And I think that, in a way, this illustrates a kind of misunderstanding about the spiritual path that I'd like to kind of address in this first teaching. So, the practice of mindfulness cutting against the grain of egocentricity is one thing, but I think it's important for us to address even the problem of egocentricity, what it is, what it isn't, to try to make it clear that egocentricity is not ego. I think popularly, in the kind of ordinary mentality of most postmodern people, when we hear the word ego, we think of the kind of egocentric or very narcissistic or selfish tendencies of, you could say, unredeemed human nature to be completely about ourselves, to really see ourselves as the center of everything. But ego in itself isn't necessarily that. And I think it's important for us to understand that ego is essentially a personal sense of self. Our kind of ordinary sense of identity that's based on where we were born, the parents we had, our personal history, and so on and so forth. So ego in itself is not a bad thing, but egocentricity is really a problem because it's an entirely diluted way of looking at reality. And the reason it's diluted is precisely because it is exactly what it sounds like, egocentricity. So when we are completely immersed in egocentricity, we're immersed in the delusion that it's all about me. It's all about me, and everything in my universe needs to center around the me. It needs to kind of line up. I often talk about having our ducks in a row. That's the kind of goal of egocentricity, is to have the whole universe of ducks lined up so that they're centered on me, on the ego. But that is really clear for anyone that looks at it with any kind of scrutiny at all. It's obvious it's a delusion, isn't it? We have a world of, I think, 5 to 6 billion people now, if I'm not mistaken. And it's clear that not all of those 5 or 6 billion people can possibly be the center of the universe. And that's bound to make for a certain amount of conflict between all those people, which we can see illustrated in our world today, especially. So egocentricity, clearly a delusion, but it's something that we're so kind of conditioned to believe that we don't even question it. We just get up every morning with the goal of having life center around ourselves. And then we inevitably, probably about a third of the way into the day, become entirely frustrated because we realize very quickly that we're not going to succeed in this endeavor. We're not going to be able to get the rest of the world and all the other 6 billion people to cooperate with our program of being the center of everything. So we're dooming ourselves to frustration when we live in egocentricity. We really are, because it's just an impossible goal that we can never really accomplish. So we need to find a way out of egocentricity, don't we? That's a kind of primary spiritual need that we have right from the beginning. And so what do we do? What to do? How can we get out of this conditioning that's constantly wanting to hold on to what we find pleasurable and to push away what we find unpleasant? At first glance, this seems like such a deeply ingrained, conditioned tendency in the human mind and heart that it seems nearly impossible to think that we could ever get beyond it. But thanks to all the great major spiritual traditions, and particularly Buddhism in this regard, we've been given a practice that can help us cut against the grain, really learn to let go of the delusion of egocentricity. And that practice is the practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness is essentially what my spiritual teacher, Bhante Hanepala Gunaratana, used to call egoless awareness. What he meant by that is that normally we go through life from this very egocentric perspective, that it's all about me. It's all about me getting what I want and avoiding what I don't want. So when we go through life like that, it's as if that we are looking at the world through a particular lens. So everything that comes into our experience is immediately judged from that perspective. So it's immediately judged from the perspective of, if I like it, I'm going to hold on to it and grasp it and try to cling to it. If I don't like it, I'm going to try to get rid of it, push it out of my life. But all of us know from personal experience that while there are many things in life that we enjoy and find pleasant, nothing wrong with that, but another thing that we can kind of observe about those things is that they're passing, aren't they? They come into our lives, we can enjoy them for a time, but eventually they fade away, they die, they leave, whatever. And that's kind of our perennial human experience with the things that we find pleasant and like. And likewise, the things we find unpleasant. We'd like to just get rid of them and banish them from our lives. And maybe we can for a while, or to a large extent, arrange our lives so that we can avoid these things. Nothing wrong with that either. It's kind of a natural tendency in all creatures of any kind. If you hold a little match flame up to an ant, a tiny little ant, it will back away from the flame. It's just instinctual. It wants to avoid discomfort. And our bodies are even created in a certain sense to help us preserve them and keep them safe by avoiding things that we find uncomfortable or make us feel some pain of some kind, whether it's mental or physical. So that kind of natural tendency, that preference To have pleasure and avoid pain is a pretty normal thing. But we go around the world looking at all the things that come into our lives through that lens all the time. So we're judging everything on the basis of whether I like it or I don't like it. And that really binds us a lot. That keeps us in fetters where we really become a slave to pleasure and a fearful kind of enemy, you could say, of pain. But every life is filled with pleasurable things and painful things. And even after awakening, that's true. That was true for the Buddha, for Jesus, for Ramana Maharshi, for anybody under the sun that you can think of that sort of represents for you what an awakened life looks like. Even after deep awakening, they really had to experience the alternative kind of realities, the constantly changing realities of pleasure and pain. So while that's normal on one level, we don't want to become a slave to that. We don't want to become somebody who perceives all of reality through this very subjective lens that judges everything according to whether I like it or I don't like it. So Buddhism, and the teaching of the Buddha, has given us a wonderful practice that we today call mindfulness. In the time of the Buddha, the time of the Buddha in the Pali language, mindfulness was called sati. Sati. It just means to be aware of what's happening now while it's happening. And as Bhante Gunaratana said, without the lens of egocentricity. So it's a non-egocentric awareness of reality that we're looking at. That's the basic, essential definition of mindfulness. I think often we imagine that mindfulness is a kind of skill that we learn, that right now we're not mindful, and then we're given a bunch of practices like mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, and we practice these mindfulness practices, and we fine-tune more and more our ability to be mindful, that it's some kind of skill that we develop. But in reality, that's not quite the case. And I think a lot of people who go into mindfulness practice enter it with this kind of misconception. And so they end up getting into a very stressful, effortful, kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach to spiritual practice, that I am going to be mindful, and then they kind of concentrate in and just sort of with hawk-eyed precision, try to be mindful, and they force themselves to pay attention to every little thing. I know when we used to practice in Vipassana retreats, we would do mindful walking, and we would go into the front yard of IMS, Insight Meditation Society, and walk around in this big yard very, very slowly. And we would label each kind of movement. So we would say, lifting, 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 as we lifted our foot. Placing, 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 placing. Setting, 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 as we sat our foot down. And we were walking very slowly. And I often thought if anybody drove by and saw us, they'd think the zombie apocalypse had come, because here we were walking around in this very kind of starry-eyed, slow, very deliberate way that nobody walks like that. And I think people would look at us and think, oh, how strange this is. What are these people doing? And in a way, I mean, that's okay. That was part of the practice, and we did it. But even then, I began wondering, like, is this really the best way to practice mindfulness? It seems so unnatural and so kind of forced. And it was difficult, to pick up your foot very, very slowly. I would often lose my balance sometimes and even fall over a couple times. So nobody walks like that, People just walk naturally. They lift up their leg, they put it forward, and they put the foot down on the ground, and then they do the same thing with the opposite leg and foot. But when we did this practice, I think we were starting from the premise that mindfulness was something that we had to work very, very hard at, that we had to kind of force ourselves to be mindful and slow everything way down, slow our eating way down, slow our walking way down, slow everything we did way, way, way down to some unnatural kind of slowness so that we could be mindful of every aspect of the movement. But in reality, I don't really think that's the way it is, because the good news for us is that mindfulness, being present to the present moment, presence, you could say, is always already present. It's not anything that we have to develop. It's just a level of consciousness. It's an aspect of consciousness that we simply need to turn to with intention. And when we do, we'll discover that at all times, there's a silent presence that's present to what we're doing at any given moment. And that makes mindfulness practice a lot more calming and relaxing and peaceful. You know, it doesn't have to be this dire kind of very sort of masculine energy of I'm going to, toxic masculine energy anyway, that I'm going to kind of force myself to do this and I'm going to tough it out. In Zen practice, I felt a lot of times, I did Zen practice for a good 10 years with 2 different teachers. And I found it to be a little bit in that tone, just kind of you force yourself into some sort of practice that's not natural to you. But I think in reality, as I say, mindfulness is our true nature. That when we let go of all the conditioning of worry about the future and nostalgia for the past, or regretting the past, or regretting what might come in the future, then what's left is this simple presence that's simply present to whatever's arising, to whatever's ceasing. And that's mindfulness. And if we turn toward mindfulness with intention, and we come to realize that we can live from that place and that it causes our life to be a lot less stressful, then it becomes really easy. Because the more we turn intentionally toward that level of consciousness that we call presence, or we could say mindfulness, the less we're caught up in regret, the less we're caught up in worry about the future. And that is that kind of worry, that regret, that's the stance of egocentricity, really. Egocentricity is often caught up in thoughts about the past or concerns about the future, and it's hardly ever present to what's going on now. And when it is present to what's going on now, it tends to want to manipulate it and get it to come out on our personal terms, to really back up this program of egocentricity that we have so conditioned into our minds, you know, that we want everything to revolve around us. And as I say, that's a frustrating kind of stance to take towards life because it's impossible to pull off, really. Jon Kabat-Zinn in the early to mid 80s came up with a program that was sponsored by the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in New England, in Massachusetts, of course, near Boston. And it was called the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Clinic. So Jon Kabat-Zinn is somebody who I know slightly, I've met a couple times, and he comes from a very similar spiritual background to me in terms of at least my Eastern spiritual background. I think he's originally Jewish in his heritage, but ended up getting very involved in Buddhist practice, I think both in Zen and Vipassana, like myself. And he discovered in his own practice that when we practice mindfulness, there's a lot less stress in our lives. We're not so concerned about the future. We're not so regretting and worried about what happened in the past, but we're just simply present in the present moment. And when we are present in the present moment, there's no real problem. You know, even if there's something we need to address, all we can do is address it and just see how it turns out. You know, and when we're present, when we're practicing mindfulness, we can really see that. we can really see that all I can do, and the only thing that's really real in the most absolute sense, is the present moments. It's really all that exists. When you think about it, the past is simply a memory, usually clouded with our own perspective, often of egocentricity. So when we think about the past and we remember events that happened, we see them through that lens. So we don't really see them objectively. We see them with a kind of colored glasses on. And you can wear, as I often say, you can wear rose-colored glasses or you can wear baby poop-colored glasses. There's all kinds of colors of lens. And the lens of egocentricity is a very stressful lens to look at life through, because we're always trying to manipulate life, to get it to come out on our terms. That's the way mindfulness really works as a transformative practice. It cuts against the grain of that. So instead of perceiving what arises, or what ceases for that matter, in terms of whether I like it or don't like it, and then subsequently either clinging to it or pushing it away, mindfulness looks at things very objectively from a kind of, I don't like the word impersonal, but I would say from a transpersonal perspective. So I'm no longer perceiving reality through this lens of the personal, that I want everything to kind of center around me and come out on my terms. I'm looking at it with more objectivity. I'm just looking at the existence of it and kind of acknowledging that and looking at that and investigating that, seeing what I can find out about that. In Vipassana practice, one of the kind of hallmarks of mindfulness in terms of the fruit of mindfulness, or the realization that happens with mindfulness, is what the Buddha called the three characteristics of all phenomenal reality. So when we practice mindfulness, when we cut against the grain of egocentricity and observe reality from this very objective, kind of neutral place, you could say, what we end up seeing in the teaching of, according to the teaching of the Buddha, are these three characteristics that he called, in the Pali language, anicca, dukkha, and anatta. So anicca means impermanence. So when we observe reality in mindfulness from that level of consciousness that's simply present, what we begin to see very clearly is that everything that arises ceases, that everything under the sun in the phenomenal world has a beginning and an end. It can never perdure forever, can never keep existing, no matter how much we like it. We can't keep it around forever. It's because it's impermanent. That's the very nature of it. That's one of its basic, essential characteristics. So when we practice mindfulness, insight into impermanence begins to arise. And that changes our whole experience of reality, and it changes our relationship to it. So when something pleasant comes along and we like it, if we see really clearly with deep insight the truth of impermanence, then we tend not to cling to it so much because we know it's futile to cling to it. A good example of this that I use a lot when I give talks, or I've used some, not lately, is the idea of receiving a rose as a gift. When we receive a rose, we're happy. Usually it sort of signifies love or respect or good wishes of some kind, or an anniversary maybe. A single rose can be a beautiful gift. And the delicacy and the beauty of the rose is sometimes breathtaking, and so we put it in a vase. My mom used to break an aspirin in the water to kind of preserve the rose for a longer time, to kind of keep it alive as long as she could. But When we receive a rose and the rose begins to fade and die, we can actually even appreciate the beauty of the fading rose, can't we? As the petals become a little less moist, a little less filled with vitality of life, and they begin to dry out and they begin to crinkle. There's a kind of beauty to that. And also in the dying of even a person, there's a kind of beauty to that fading reality of death. It's part of life, death. It's part of the phenomenal world. It's one of the three characteristics that the Buddha said is true of all phenomenal reality, from a rose to an elephant. All of it is impermanent. Even the earth itself is impermanent, ultimately. The highest mountain peak that exists on the planet that we all take pictures of, and it seems so solid and secure and permanent, and it's not. It's gradually fading away. So that's the reality of one of the three characteristics that arises out of our practice of mindfulness. It's a kind of insight that comes to us, an awakening, you could say, to impermanence. The next characteristic that the Buddha mentions is the characteristic of what he called dukkha. Dukkha is most usually translated suffering. But in reality, all my Buddhist teachers that I had would always point out that a closer approximation to the term dukkha would be it's hard to say. It's kind of a word that's hard to get your tongue around, but I think they used to call it insubstantiality, or that nothing is really going to last. So it has that element of impermanence, but it also is never anything that you can really get a hold of and appreciate, and it's unchanging. It's not unchanging. It's like, often also Bhante Gunaratana used to say imperfection is even a good translation for the word dukkha, because whatever it is that we love in this world, or for that matter, whatever it is we hate in this world, is really not going to last. It's impermanent and it's imperfect. So even if we love it, even if it's something that we really enjoy, its beauty will fade. It's whatever we find in it that we enjoy or find pleasurable will gradually pass away. And even in its zenith of life, even when it's really in the prime of its life, whatever it is we're attached to and feel pleasure from is not perfectly pleasurable. There's always something about it that we don't like. Any person that we love, if we really spend some time with them, I feel confident to say there'll be something about them that we don't particularly appreciate. And the same with us. They won't particularly appreciate every single thing that is part of who we are. There will be aspects of our person that they find tedious or difficult to deal with, or just kind of causing them suffering of some kind. And that's maybe where the word dukkha derives that normal sort of definition of suffering. That whatever it is, no matter how wonderful it is, no matter how pleasant it is, there's something about it that brings about suffering. If nothing else, the fact that it passes away is kind of part of its imperfection, because we can never find any kind of absolute or lasting happiness in anything, no matter how wonderful or marvelous it might be. A lot of people think about winning the lottery and becoming very wealthy, or becoming a famous performer or writer or actor. And they think, oh, that would be wonderful. I'd have unlimited funds. I'd be, surrounded by the most expensive sort of articles and food, and I'd be waited on by other people. And they think, oh, that would be great. That'd be wonderful. I really want that. But that also has that element of it. All of that has the element of dukkha in it. Because eventually we will become old and sick, or young and sick, you know, or we'll suddenly die in the prime of health. But in any case, all of those wonderful experiences that come from wealth and fame will be taken away from us sooner or later. You know, so we can enjoy things like that while they're here, but we need to kind of always keep in mind that they're impermanent, that they're imperfect, and not just keep them in mind as a kind of intellectual belief we consent to, but to actually practice mindfulness and see these characteristics for ourselves in our own direct experience. That's what the practice of mindfulness is really getting at, is for us to look very deeply at experience as it arises and as it ceases, and to allow the innate wisdom in our heart to arise about that phenomena and really come to understand what it is and what it isn't. So the first two characteristics that the Buddha says are the fruit, the realization of them are the fruit of mindfulness practice, is impermanence and, let's say, imperfection. The third characteristic that the Buddha talks about is called, in the Pali language, anatta. Anatta is often translated no self. And that's a teaching that has crossed over from classical Buddhist teaching into postmodern, non-affiliated, Western, yet Eastern-inspired, non-dual teaching. So a lot of people use the term no self quite frequently. And I think a lot of people have this idea that they know what that means, but often, at least according to my Buddhist master teacher, Bhante Hanepala Gunaratana, most people's understanding of what we call no self, and at least in the non-dual context of spiritual teaching, is often a misunderstanding of the classical teaching that the Buddha gave. Many people in Neo-Advaita non-dual circles think that the idea of no self is basically pointing to a truth that we do not exist in a personal sense, that the personal me is an absolute delusion that doesn't exist. It's simply a kind of mental construct in the mind that in actual fact does not exist. But that was really not what the Buddha was pointing to. My teacher, again, Bhante Gunaratana, used to always say that the term no self was missing a word. He said, rather than just saying no self and risking people misunderstanding what it means and them thinking that it means that they don't exist on a personal level somehow, he said it would be more accurate and better to translate anatta rather than no self to be no separate self. Because no separate self is an aspect of no self. It's a kind of a dimension of that, that characteristic of reality that the Buddha talks about. So what that's saying is that there is nothing in the whole world, no person, no dog, no cat, no table, no chair, no mountain, no tree, nothing at all. You can fill in the blank with whatever you like, any kind of phenomenal object. There's nothing that exists independently, that exists separate somehow from the rest of reality. But that's the way we normally see reality, that there's these very distinct individual things that exist in some sort of absolute vacuum of independence. But the Buddha's insight was that if you look at everything very closely through the lens of mindfulness, rather than through the lens of egocentricity, what you begin to see with some clarity is that everything is conditioned by something else. So in other words, everything in the phenomenal world arises from something. And then other things arise from that thing. That there's a kind of chain of causation that is behind all phenomenal reality. And that's kind of the real truth of no self, of anatta. It's not that individual reality or the world or you as a person or me as a person don't exist at all. That's simply nihilism, frankly. That's not what the Buddha was talking about. What he was pointing to was the insight that arises when we observe very closely in our own direct experience. When we observe phenomenal reality, we observe its arising, we observe its ceasing. We come to see all three of these characteristics. And the final one is anatta, is no separate self. And also, another aspect of anatta could be called, if you wanted to kind of translate it and add an extra word, no unchanging self. So all phenomena, again, a dog, a cat, a mountain, a tree, a person, a giraffe, whatever, none of it is unchanging. So therefore, on an absolute level, you could say accurately that it has a kind of emptiness to it because it's constantly a turnover of cells, of literally a turnover of cells. I've heard people say that in 7 years' time, all the cells in a human body have been rejuvenated and changed. So a person 7 years from now would literally not be the same person they were 7 years previously. That every 7 years, everything shifts over and changes. And yet, there's a kind of continuity there. When we look back on pictures of ourselves as little children, and now we're maybe 45-year-old person, and we look back on a picture of ourselves at the age of 4, it's a different person, isn't it? It's not the same person at all. They look differently. They think differently. They perceive reality differently. The perceptions of a 4-year-old are the perceptions of a 4-year-old, and the perceptions of a 45-year-old are quite different because they're perceiving from a completely different perspective. And so that's also part of the truth of no self, the insight or the realization of no self that arises out of the practice of mindfulness. So as you can see, the practice of mindfulness is a very, very deep, transformative practice. And it actually is quite revolutionary. As we look at life through the lens of mindfulness rather than the lens of egocentricity, our whole experience of life begins to change. And our relationship to experiences, to other people, to ourselves begins to change. We begin to hold on to this relative reality of a human life much more loosely, because we realize that it's anicca, dukkha, and anatta. We realize in our own direct experience that it's impermanent, it's imperfect, and it's empty of any perduring self or any independent self that doesn't rely completely on the rest of reality for its existence. All of us are what we would call radically contingent beings. In other words, we're contingent upon something else. Even on the grossest physical level, you could say, well, this woman and this man came together and then this baby came from that union. So there's not a single person on the world and on the planet that exists independently at all. We all came from something. We all came from someone. And that's true of absolutely everything. So when we see reality through these lenses of the three characteristics of the insights that arise with mindfulness, of impermanence, imperfection, and no perduring or no separate self, we just begin to live our lives a lot differently when that becomes habitual. And what we would call that awakening, when that becomes habitual, when we really see the three characteristics quite clearly with no kind of delusion about it, what we would call that awakening would be the awakening to the witness. So now I'd like to actually do a little component of kind of experiential component where we will guide you through a mindfulness practice, a basic mindfulness practice, and that will lead to the awakening of the witness. Hi, everyone. We would like to start with this guided meditation, which is essentially a mindfulness of the body. In the 80s, I actually was one of the very first people to take the mindfulness-based stress reduction clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. And one of the really wonderful practices that they teach there, and it's kind of a very central part of the program, is the body scan. And that is a basic mindfulness of the body practice. So we'll be doing that in this practice component, mindfulness of the body. And then afterwards, my colleague Mike will give you a guided meditation on mindfulness of mind that will help you practice mindfulness on the level of body and or mind. So let's just begin. So simply sit quietly with your eyes closed, your hands in your lap in some comfortable position that you won't have to move around too much. And start by becoming aware of the breath. So just be aware of the breath coming in and going out. Focus on whatever predominates in your experience of breathing. For some people, it's the air coming in at the tip of the nose as it comes through the nostrils. For other people, it's the rising and falling of the abdomen with each in-breath and each out-breath. For some, it might be a combination of both of those things. But just rest in the experience of breathing. And if thoughts or distractions come into the mind, just dismiss them and return to the breath. Each in-breath, a slight pause or gap at the end of the in-breath, and then the out-breath. And just rest in the experience of breathing. Allow the breath to simply be a calming, peaceful experience. Like the going out and the coming in of the tide as you stand by the ocean. The breath just rhythmically goes out and in. And all you have to do is turn toward that experience and realize that presence is perfectly present to that incoming and outgoing of the breath. And now I would like you to start focusing in on the area of your body from the crown of your head to the bottom of your neck, the entire head. You're still peripherally aware of the breath coming in and going out, coming into the head and going out of the head. But also just be conscious of every little sensation from the crown of your head to the bottom of your neck. Normally, we just ignore the sensations in this area of our body, but we can be aware and come to understand that there are myriads of sensations happening in this little area of our body. We can feel our hair touching our ears or our neck or our forehead. We can feel our eyelids shut, touching one another. We can feel the sensation of our lips touching. We can feel our tongue lying in our mouth, the sides of which are touching our teeth. We can feel the sensations of our inner jaw on our teeth, the inside of our mouth on our teeth. We might feel our teeth touching together. Usually when we focus on such a small area, we start to feel some sort of little itch or whatever. We can feel free to scratch that. You don't have to stay perfectly still, but just be completely aware of every sensation that arises. If a little itch happens in the back of your head, feel that and feel the scratching of your fingernail on that little itch to relieve the itching. Feel the collar of your shirt on your neck or whatever is touching your neck. Just feel everything in that area of the head. Feel the breath going in and out of the head. And now simply expand the field of awareness to include the area of your body from your neck down to below your chest, just below your chest. And that would include your arms, which are in that area at the shoulders. Simply feel all the sensations in this area of your body from the bottom of your neck to the bottom of your chest and your arms. You feel the feeling of fabric from your shirt or blouse against that part of your body. You feel your hands resting on your knees or on your lap or wherever, however they're resting. Feel all the aliveness in that part of your body. Any itch, any pain, coolness, whatever arises in your experience in this area of the body. And just linger there for a minute. And now move down the body and focus your primary attention in the area below the chest to the waist. That's the kind of largest part of what we would call your torso. Simply feel the sensations of clothing touching that or not, whichever the case may be. Feel any tingling, warmth, coolness, pain, whatever you're experiencing in this area of your body. Just recognize that there is an aspect of consciousness that's simply present to that when you turn to notice that with intention. And all of the noticing of mindfulness does not look at it in terms of pleasure or pain. It simply notices what's there. It simply notices what is, without the filter of egocentricity that judges what is. Now move the field of awareness down the body to the area between your waist and your knees. Feel the sensations of clothing on this part of your body. Feel any heat or coolness. Feel whatever sensation arises in this area of the body and simply focus in on that with intention. And now move down the body to focus in with mindful awareness in the area that lies between your knees and the soles of your feet. And be aware of whatever sensation arises in this area of the body. Simply allow yourself to enter into any sensation in this area. And now just be aware of any sensation of sitting throughout your whole body, from the top of your head to the soles of your feet. Be aware of the breath, breathing into the body and breathing out of the body. And allow yourself to rest as a body, just being aware of all the sensations that are arising and ceasing as they arise and cease. Just rest in this awareness of the body for as long as it feels appropriate. Allow the breath to center you in your body and feel the experience of being fully present to the body.
Thank you, Fran, for that wonderful meditation. That body awareness, mindfulness of body is such a powerful and calming, for me at least. I know part of the practice of that is that we just bring awareness to what's in our body. But for me today, that was a very relaxing and calming experience. So as Fran explained, what I'm going to do now is present a guided meditation called Cultivating the Witness Consciousness. And this is for mindfulness of the mind. So this is a practice that we can engage in, mindfulness practice that can help us notice what is here along with the appearance of the mind and feelings and thoughts and so on. So sit comfortably, either on a chair or on a meditation cushion, and place your hands palm down on your thighs, or at rest on the fingers of one hand on the upturned palm of the other, with the tips of your thumbs lightly touching. Let your eyes close and turn your eyes slightly downward. Now take a couple of deep, slow, and pleasantly soft breaths. As you inhale, notice a rising in your abdomen. And as you exhale, notice your abdomen relaxing back into its neutral position. Repeat this 6 or 7 times, and with each exhale, release any unnecessary tension in your face, neck, throat, or your shoulders. So just as we did in the mindfulness of body meditation with Fran just a moment ago, just get yourself into a relaxed state of being and notice the breath. Relax the muscles in your shoulders and your face, and just let breath enter and leave the body. Now, as you sit in a relaxed posture, in a relaxed manner, turn your attention inward to begin noticing the contents of your mind. Notice any thoughts that may be appearing, any internal chattering or mental dialogue, and also notice any images that may be flashing in your mind. So in this practice, as we notice a thought coming into our mind, or we notice an image appearing in our mind's eye, we'll just label those different thoughts, either thinking or image. And as we do that, we want to notice the spaces between the thoughts and images. So if there is no thought or image present in your awareness, we're simply going to label it space. So every 5 or 10 seconds or so, simply name silently to yourself what's happening in your mind. If what is arising are thoughts, internal dialogue, we'll simply say thinking. And if what is arising is an image, an internal picture of, say, a friend that you had lunch with yesterday, or an image of a calendar, a date on a calendar of something you've got to do, whatever it is, if it's an image, we'll say image. And if it's thoughts, we'll say thinking. And if there are no thoughts or no images arising, we'll simply say space. As you label the thoughts and images, maintain this attitude of a detached but also a kind observer. So it's not a detached, cold observer, but it's almost as though you're saying, hello, thoughts, or hello, images, in a friendly and relaxed way. Don't make any attempt to change the thoughts or images in any way. Simply observe them, and for the purposes of the practice, we'll label them. On their own, they will arise. They'll have a certain duration, and then they'll dissolve. So as you practice, you may notice that over the space of even just a minute, your labeling of thoughts and images might be something like this. Images, space, thinking, space, thinking, space, images, space, images, space. And it'll be different for each of us. And it'll be different each day that you practice, and different each time of day you practice. And sometimes it may be that you are not even so present enough to label the images, but you're simply aware that thinking is happening, that images are appearing, and that there is space in between them. The key, I think, here is to notice that there's space and silence in between and in and around those thoughts and those images. That even if images are appearing in our mind, something that is causing us to think in a certain way, or let's say there's images in our mind that make us feel a certain way, memories, images of somebody we love who is suffering, or an image of something that is going to be happening in the future that might be causing us fear or anxiety or panic. That along with those images and along with that thinking, there is also space and silence and stillness, something that's untouched by the content within it. Now, also notice that the part of yourself that's observing and labeling and thinking and creating images, just notice that part that's noticing. And this is what we call the witness consciousness. And it's the aspect of awareness that remains forever untouched by the contents, untouched by the thoughts and images arising within it. A traditional metaphor for this witnessing awareness is that it is similar to the deepest parts of an ocean, which remains calm, still, and silent, even as its surface ripples and waves. And these ripples of waves could be thinking, emotion, or sensation when we relate them to our own direct experience. So those waves can be raging, those waves can be gently rippling, whatever they're doing underneath that activity of mind and emotion, there is a deep stillness always present. Another traditional metaphor for the witness is that it is like the smooth surface of a mirror upon which thoughts and internal images, perceptions, and sensations appear, like reflections appearing within the mirror, or reflections or images appearing upon a screen. Ask yourself, does this witnessing consciousness share the limits of the phenomena that it perceives and observes? When you're ready to end the practice, take another couple of deep, slow breaths with your abdomen rising and with the inhalation and relaxing back with the exhalation. And then notice how you feel and slowly open your eyes.